The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Blackstone Hotel's grand ballroom. Amara Williams stood near the champagne fountain, her midnight blue dress elegant against her dark skin, watching the city's elite mingle and laugh. She had spent 3 years building her consulting firm from nothing, and tonight's charity gala represented everything she had worked for. The invitation to speak about empowering women entrepreneurs had arrived 6 months ago, and she had carefully planned every detail of this evening. Her husband Marcus stood across the room, deep in conversation with potential investors. At 35, he had built his tech empire through sheer determination, creating software solutions that revolutionized how hospitals managed patient data. Tonight, he was on the verge of securing the biggest deal of his career, a $10 billion partnership with Thornfield Industries that would take his company global. Amara smoothed her dress and checked her watch. In 20 minutes, she would take the stage to deliver the keynote address that could change everything for her business. The speech tucked in her purse represented months of research, personal stories, and dreams she had carried since childhood. Growing up in Detroit, she had watched her mother work 3 jobs to keep their family afloat, never having the opportunity to pursue her own entrepreneurial dreams. Tonight was about honoring that sacrifice and inspiring other women to break through barriers. The ballroom buzzed with conversations about million-dollar donations and business ventures. Waiters glided between guests carrying silver trays laden with delicate appetizers and vintage wine. Amara recognized faces from magazine covers and news broadcasts, tech moguls, real estate tycoons, and philanthropists whose names graced hospital wings and university buildings. She made her way through the crowd, stopping to exchange pleasantries with other speakers and donors. Dr. Sarah Chen, who ran a nonprofit providing medical care in underserved communities, squeezed her hand warmly. "I'm so excited to hear your speech tonight, Amara. The work you're doing with women-owned businesses is incredible." "Thank you, Sarah. Your presentation about healthcare access was powerful. It's amazing what happens when passionate people come together for a cause." As they chatted, Amara noticed a commotion near the bar. A woman with platinum blonde hair and a designer dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary was gesturing dramatically while speaking to a small group. Her voice carried across the room with an air of entitlement that made several nearby conversations pause. "That's Victoria Thornfield," Dr. Chen whispered. "Richard Thornfield's wife. Thornfield Industries owns half the commercial real estate in the city." Amara nodded, recognizing the name. Marcus had mentioned the Thornfields several times over the past few months. Richard Thornfield was the key decision-maker in the partnership deal that could transform Marcus's company. She made a mental note to introduce herself later, knowing how important this relationship was to her husband's dreams. The evening's host, Jonathan Blake, approached with his characteristic warm smile. As president of the Children's Hospital Foundation, he had organized tonight's gala to raise funds for a new pediatric wing. "Amara, you look absolutely radiant tonight. Are you ready to inspire our audience?" "As ready as I'll ever be," she laughed, feeling a flutter of nervous excitement. 3 years ago, I was pitching my business plan from my kitchen table. Now I'm about to speak to some of the most influential people in the city. "And that's exactly why your story matters," Jonathan replied. "People need to hear about real journeys, not just the highlight reels they see on social media." Across the room, Marcus caught her eye and smiled. He was standing with Richard Thornfield, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions worth billions. Their conversation appeared animated and positive, which gave Amara hope that the evening might bring good news for both of them. She excused herself from Jonathan and began walking toward the ladies' room to touch up her makeup before the speech. The corridor leading away from the main ballroom was quieter, lined with portraits of the hotel's distinguished guests from decades past. The soft carpet muffled the sound of her heels as she moved through the elegant space. As she passed a small alcove, she overheard Victoria Thornfield's voice, now speaking in hushed tones to another woman. "Did you see Marcus Williams brought his wife tonight? I don't understand why Richard is even considering doing business with these people. They don't understand our world, our standards." Amara stopped, feeling her stomach tighten. She recognized the casual racism in Victoria's tone, the assumption that she and Marcus somehow didn't belong in this sophisticated environment. It was a feeling she had encountered before but had hoped to leave behind as she climbed the social and professional ladder. Richard says Williams has impressive technology, the other woman replied, her voice uncertain. Technology is one thing, darling. But business is about relationships, about trust, about knowing that your partners understand the delicate nature of high society. Some people are simply more suitable than others. The words hit Amara like a physical blow. She had worked tirelessly to build her reputation, to prove herself worthy of respect and recognition. The idea that her race made her unsuitable in Victoria's eyes was both infuriating and heartbreaking. She composed herself and continued to the ladies' room, determined not to let Victoria's prejudice derail her focus. Tonight was about her speech, about inspiring other women, about showing the world what she had accomplished despite obstacles like small-minded people who judged others by the color of their skin. In the mirror, she looked at her reflection and straightened her shoulders. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, "Success is the best revenge, baby girl. You show them who you are through your actions, not your reactions." When she returned to the ballroom, the energy had shifted. Guests were taking their seats at round tables draped in white linen and adorned with elegant centerpieces. The auction portion of the evening was beginning, with items ranging from vacation packages to original artwork. Amara found Marcus at their assigned table, his face glowing with excitement. "How did your conversation with Mr. Thornfield go?" she asked, settling into her chair. "Better than I could have hoped," Marcus whispered. "He's impressed with our latest software updates and the security protocols we've developed. He thinks the partnership could revolutionize healthcare data management across all his properties. We're meeting tomorrow morning to discuss the final details." Amara smiled, genuinely happy for her husband's success while still feeling the sting of Victoria's earlier comments. She decided not to mention the overheard conversation, not wanting to dampen Marcus's enthusiasm on such an important night. The auction proceeded with spirited bidding on luxury items. A week in Tuscany went for $15,000, a private wine tasting for $8,000. The atmosphere was festive and generous, with the running total for the hospital fund climbing toward the $1 million goal. Jonathan Blake took the microphone to introduce the evening's keynote speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to introduce a remarkable entrepreneur whose journey embodies the American dream. 3 years ago, Amara Williams started a consulting firm with nothing but determination and a laptop. Today, her company helps hundreds of women-owned businesses thrive in competitive markets. Please join me in welcoming Amara Williams." The applause was warm and encouraging as Amara walked to the podium. She looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, some new, all representing different paths to success and influence. Her speech was carefully crafted to be both personal and inspiring, sharing her struggles and triumphs while offering practical advice to aspiring entrepreneurs. "When I started my company," she began, her voice clear and confident, "people told me the market was too competitive, that I didn't have the right connections, that success required resources I simply didn't possess. What they didn't understand is that disadvantages can become advantages when you learn to see opportunities where others see obstacles." The audience was attentive, leaning forward as she described her journey from her mother's daughter to successful business owner. She spoke about the importance of mentorship, about lifting other women as you climb, about refusing to accept limitations imposed by others' narrow thinking. As she delivered her speech, Amara felt the power of her own words. This moment represented everything she had worked for, not just financial success, but the platform to inspire others, to show young girls who looked like her that their dreams were valid and achievable. Near the conclusion of her speech, she noticed Victoria Thornfield at a table near the front, her expression cold and dismissive. The woman was checking her phone rather than listening, her body language broadcasting disrespect and disinterest. In closing, Amara said, her voice gaining strength, "I want to remind everyone that true success isn't just about personal achievement. It's about creating opportunities for others, about building bridges instead of walls, about recognizing that our differences make us stronger, not weaker. When we embrace diversity in all its forms, we don't just do the right thing, we do the smart thing. The future belongs to those who understand that innovation comes from including voices that have been historically excluded." The applause was thunderous, with many guests rising to their feet. Amara felt a surge of satisfaction and pride as she returned to her table. Marcus squeezed her hand, his eyes bright with admiration. "That was incredible," he whispered. "You were absolutely brilliant up there." As the evening continued with dessert and coffee service, several attendees approached Amara to share their appreciation for her speech and to discuss potential business opportunities. The networking was exactly what she had hoped for: meaningful connections with people who could help her expand her impact. Dr. Chen introduced her to Maria Rodriguez, who ran a foundation supporting Latina entrepreneurs. "Your speech resonated with so many of us who have faced similar challenges," Maria said. "I'd love to explore ways we might collaborate." The conversations were energizing and promising, making Amara feel that her vulnerable storytelling had created genuine connections rather than just polite applause. This was why she did this work, not for recognition, but for the opportunity to open doors for others who might face the same barriers she had overcome. As the evening began to wind down, she noticed Victoria Thornfield approaching their table. The woman's smile was practiced and hollow, the kind of expression people wear when fulfilling social obligations they find distasteful. "Mrs. Williams," Victoria said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "What an interesting speech tonight. So passionate." The way she said passionate made it clear she considered it a criticism rather than a compliment. Amara shook her hand politely, maintaining her gracious demeanor despite the underlying tension. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornfield. I understand your husband and mine have been discussing a potential partnership. Marcus speaks very highly of Thornfield Industries' reputation and vision." "Yes, well, Richard does love his technology projects," Victoria replied with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Though I sometimes wonder if he fully considers all the implications of new business relationships." The comment hung in the air like a barely concealed threat. Amara felt the familiar burn of anger at the subtle racism, but she maintained her composure, refusing to give Victoria the reaction she seemed to be seeking. The tension between Amara and Victoria crackled like electricity in the air, unnoticed by the other guests who continued their conversations and laughter around them. Marcus, engaged in an animated discussion with Richard Thornfield about data encryption protocols, remained oblivious to the subtle warfare happening just a few feet away. Victoria's smile grew sharper as she continued, "I do hope you understand that in our circles, business partnerships require a certain cultural compatibility. Richard's investors expect a particular standard of sophistication and refinement." Amara's grip tightened on her wineglass, but her voice remained steady and professional. "I'm confident that Marcus's technological innovations and business acumen speak for themselves, Mrs. Thornfield. Success in the modern marketplace depends on results, not superficial perceptions." "Oh, my dear," Victoria laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. "You have such quaint ideas about how the world works. In our level of society, perception is everything. Image matters just as much as substance, perhaps more so." The conversation was drawing curious glances from nearby tables. Dr. Chen, who had been speaking with the foundation board members, noticed the growing tension and began moving closer, her instincts as a physician alerting her to trouble. Victoria seemed energized by Amara's discomfort, her voice gaining volume and confidence. "Take tonight's speech, for example. Very spirited. But perhaps a bit too political for such an elegant gathering? Some of our guests found it rather presumptuous to lecture about diversity and inclusion at a charity event meant to support sick children." Amara felt her composure beginning to crack. The accusation that her message of empowerment was inappropriate struck at the heart of everything she believed in. Supporting diversity and inclusion benefits everyone, Mrs. Thornfield. Including sick children who deserve to see doctors and leaders who look like them. "How noble," Victoria replied, her tone dripping with condescension. "Though I wonder if you truly understand the delicate balance required in philanthropic circles. Donors contribute because they trust the organization's judgment and values. When speakers use the platform for personal agendas." "Personal agendas?" Amara's voice rose slightly, causing Marcus to look up from his conversation. "Inspiring women to pursue entrepreneurship and advocating for equal opportunities is hardly a personal agenda. It's a moral imperative. Victoria's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction at getting a reaction. Moral imperatives are such subjective things, aren't they? What seems righteous to some appears quite different to others. Particularly to those who've built their success through more traditional means. The implication was clear that Amara's success was somehow less legitimate because she had spoken about overcoming racial and gender barriers. The attack was personal and calculated, designed to undermine not just Amara's confidence but her very right to be in this space. Marcus finally excused himself from his conversation and approached the women, sensing the escalating tension. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his protective instincts activated by the strained expressions he observed. "Oh, perfectly fine," Victoria assured him with a bright smile that transformed her face completely. "Your wife and I were just discussing the evening's entertainment. Such passionate speakers you've provided tonight, Mrs. Williams." The way she emphasized passionate made it clear she was categorizing Amara as entertainment rather than a serious businesswoman. It was a masterful display of social manipulation, appearing gracious to outside observers while delivering cutting insults to her target. Richard Thornfield joined the group, his weathered face creased in confusion at the obvious tension. "Victoria, darling, I hope you're making our new friends feel welcome. Marcus has been telling me fascinating things about his company's expansion plans." "Of course, Richard," Victoria replied smoothly. "I was just getting to know Mrs. Williams better. Such an interesting background she has." The word interesting carried the same dismissive undertone as her previous comments. Amara realized that Victoria was systematically attempting to poison her husband's impression of both her and Marcus, using coded language that sounded polite to casual observers but carried clear messages of disapproval and exclusion. "Amara's speech tonight was incredible," Marcus said proudly, placing a supportive hand on his wife's shoulder. "She spoke about building bridges and creating opportunities for everyone." The response was overwhelmingly positive. "Indeed," Richard nodded enthusiastically. "Very inspiring message. Victoria, you should have paid closer attention instead of checking your phone." Victoria's composure flickered for just a moment before she recovered. Being called out by her husband in public clearly irritated her, and Amara could see the woman's anger redirecting toward her as the perceived cause of the embarrassment. "I heard every word," Victoria said tightly. "Some messages are quite memorable." The conversation was interrupted by Jonathan Blake, who approached with a clipboard and an expression of gratitude. "Amara, I wanted to thank you again for tonight's presentation. We've already received several inquiries from people interested in supporting women entrepreneurs. Your words clearly resonated." "That's wonderful to hear," Amara replied, feeling a surge of validation despite Victoria's attempts to diminish her impact. The whole point was to inspire action, not just applause. Victoria seized the opening like a predator sensing weakness. "Action is certainly important," she said with false sweetness. "Though I do worry when charity events become platforms for social activism. Our guests come to support sick children, not to hear lectures about workplace equality." Jonathan's eyebrows rose in surprise at the criticism. "I thought Mrs. Williams' speech perfectly captured the spirit of empowerment we hope to foster tonight. Teaching children that they can achieve anything regardless of their background seems entirely appropriate for a children's hospital fundraiser." Of course, Victoria backtracked slightly, realizing her criticism might reflect poorly on her husband's business interests. "I simply believe in maintaining the proper tone for such occasions. Elegance and refinement should take precedence over political messaging. I wasn't aware that encouraging women to pursue their dreams was considered political," Amara said quietly, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Or that advocating for equal opportunities somehow lacked elegance and refinement." The group had grown quiet, with several nearby conversations pausing as people sensed the escalating conflict. Victoria seemed to realize she had pushed too far in front of witnesses, but her pride prevented her from backing down gracefully. "My dear, I'm simply suggesting that there are appropriate venues for different types of discourse," Victoria said, her smile becoming increasingly strained. "Tonight's setting called for something more universally appealing, less divisive." "Divisive?" Amara repeated, her composure finally beginning to crack. Inspiring women to build businesses and supporting diversity is only divisive to people who benefit from maintaining barriers and exclusions. Marcus stepped closer to his wife, recognizing the signs of her controlled anger. Richard Thornfield looked increasingly uncomfortable, clearly wishing his wife would drop the subject that was threatening to derail his business negotiations. Victoria, however, seemed determined to press her advantage, perhaps believing she could provoke Amara into an outburst that would justify her prejudices. I think we simply have different perspectives on what constitutes appropriate public discourse. In my experience, the most successful people achieve their goals without needing to constantly reference their backgrounds or circumstances. The implication stung deeply that Amara's acknowledgement of the barriers she had overcome somehow made her success less legitimate or her message less worthy. It was a classic technique used to silence voices that challenged comfortable assumptions about merit and opportunity. Success means different things to different people, Amara replied, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her. To some, it means accumulating wealth and influence while maintaining existing power structures. To others, it means creating opportunities for those who have been systematically excluded from those same structures. How philosophical, Victoria laughed dismissively. Though I wonder if such lofty ideals translate into practical business results. Richard's investors care about profits and stability, not social experiments. The phrase social experiments was clearly meant to diminish both Marcus's business and Amara's advocacy work, suggesting that diversity and inclusion were untested theories rather than proven strategies for innovation and growth. Richard Thornfield finally intervened, his business instincts overriding his reluctance to publicly disagree with his wife. Actually, Victoria, the research shows quite clearly that diverse leadership teams consistently outperform homogeneous ones. Marcus's approach to inclusive hiring and community engagement is part of what makes his company so attractive as a partner. The correction hung in the air, creating an awkward silence as Victoria processed being contradicted by her husband in front of the people she had been attempting to exclude and diminish. Victoria's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but she forced her social smile back into place. Of course, darling. I'm sure you know best about such technical matters. The condescension in her voice made it clear that she considered her husband's business judgment flawed, at least where it concerned partnering with Marcus and his company. The tension was becoming impossible to ignore, with other guests beginning to stare openly at the increasingly uncomfortable confrontation. Dr. Chen, who had been watching the exchange with growing concern, decided to intervene. Perhaps we should give our speakers a chance to enjoy the rest of the evening, she suggested diplomatically. It's been such a successful fundraiser. But Victoria seemed unable or unwilling to let the matter drop, her frustration and prejudice overriding her usual social caution. Success is subjective, isn't it? She said with a brittle laugh. Though I suppose we'll see soon enough whether tonight's partnerships prove as fruitful as everyone hopes. The veiled threat was unmistakable. Victoria was suggesting that her displeasure with Amara could impact the business deal that meant everything to Marcus's company. It was a power play designed to force Amara into submission or risk devastating consequences for her husband's dreams. Marcus finally understood what was happening, his expression hardening as he realized his wife was being subjected to racist intimidation disguised as polite conversation. Mrs. Thornfield, he said firmly, I think there may be some misunderstanding here. Marcus's intervention seemed to embolden Victoria rather than deter her, as if she viewed his protection of his wife as confirmation of her suspicions about their character and suitability. Her smile became predatory, sensing an opportunity to demonstrate the power she wielded in these social circles. No misunderstanding at all, Mr. Williams, Victoria replied smoothly. I was simply sharing some observations about tonight's atmosphere. In my experience, successful partnerships require harmony in all aspects, professional, social, and cultural. The threat was becoming more explicit with each exchange. Victoria was making it clear that she considered Amara's presence and voice a liability that could jeopardize the business relationship her husband desperately needed. Richard Thornfield's discomfort was visible as he watched his wife systematically alienate the business partners he had spent months courting. Victoria, perhaps we should discuss this privately, he suggested, his voice carrying a warning tone. Nonsense, darling, Victoria responded with false brightness. I think it's important that our new friends understand the expectations and standards that come with our level of business partnership. Transparency is so important in building trust. Amara felt the familiar surge of rage that came with being treated as if she were invisible while people discussed her worthiness in her presence. The conversation had moved beyond subtle racism into open intimidation, with Victoria essentially demanding that Amara silence herself and conform to some unstated behavioral code as the price of her husband's business success. "I appreciate your concern for transparency, Mrs. Thornfield," Amara said, her voice carrying the steel she had developed through years of navigating hostile professional environments. "Perhaps you could be more specific about these expectations and standards you mentioned." Victoria's eyes glittered with malicious pleasure at the challenge, clearly believing she held all the cards in this confrontation. "Well, for instance, understanding that certain venues call for certain types of presentation. Tonight's charity gala was meant to celebrate philanthropy and community spirit, not to serve as a platform for personal advocacy or political messaging." "And what exactly about inspiring women to pursue entrepreneurship strikes you as inappropriate political messaging?" Amara pressed, refusing to allow Victoria to hide behind euphemisms and coded language. The directness of the question seemed to catch Victoria off guard, but she quickly recovered, her social training kicking in to help her maintain plausible deniability while delivering her message. "It's not the content, dear, it's the approach," Victoria said with practiced patience, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "In sophisticated circles, we prefer subtlety over activism. Grace over grievance. Inspiration through example rather than through lecturing about barriers and obstacles." The criticism cut deep because it attacked not just Amara's message but her right to speak her truth, to acknowledge the challenges she had overcome without being labeled divisive or inappropriate. Victoria was essentially demanding that Amara pretend discrimination didn't exist as the price of admission to elite spaces. Marcus stepped forward, his protective instincts fully activated. "Mrs. Thornfield, my wife has every right to share her experiences and perspective. Her success speaks for itself, and her message tonight was both inspiring and appropriate." "Of course she has the right," Victoria agreed with false magnanimity. "I'm simply suggesting that rights and responsibilities often go hand in hand. When one accepts the privilege of addressing influential people, one might consider whether the message serves the broader community or merely personal interests." The accusation that Amara's advocacy work served only her personal interests rather than the broader community was particularly galling, given the hours she spent mentoring young entrepreneurs and supporting other women's businesses without compensation. Dr. Chen, who had been listening with growing alarm, finally spoke up. "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding here. Amara's work supporting women entrepreneurs benefits the entire business community. Her speech tonight was exactly what this event needed, authentic inspiration from someone who has overcome real challenges." Victoria turned her attention to Dr. Chen with the same calculated smile. "And I'm sure your perspective as a healthcare provider gives you unique insights into what our community needs. Though I wonder if medical professionals always understand the delicate dynamics of high-level business relationships." The dismissal was smooth and practiced, suggesting that Victoria had years of experience in marginalizing voices that challenged her worldview. She was systematically attempting to isolate Amara by undermining anyone who supported her. Richard Thornfield's face was growing redder with embarrassment and frustration. "Victoria, I think we should." "Richard, darling, I'm simply trying to help our new friends understand the landscape they're entering," Victoria interrupted, her tone suggesting that her husband's concerns were naive and misplaced. "Business at this level involves so much more than products and profits. It's about relationships, reputation, social harmony." The phrase social harmony was particularly loaded, implying that Amara's presence and voice disrupted some natural order that should be preserved at all costs. Jonathan Blake, who had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, decided to attempt diplomatic intervention. "I think we're all on the same side here," he said with forced cheerfulness. "Tonight has been tremendously successful, and everyone contributed to that success." Victoria seized on his comment like a weapon. "Exactly my point, Jonathan. Success requires everyone understanding their role and playing it appropriately. When someone uses a charitable platform to advance personal agendas, it can undermine the very cause we're trying to support. The accusation stung because it was both false and impossible to disprove without seeming defensive. Victoria had masterfully positioned herself as the defender of charity and appropriate behavior while casting Amara as a selfish opportunist who had hijacked the evening for personal gain. What personal agenda? Amara asked directly, deciding to force Victoria into the open rather than allowing her to continue hiding behind implications and suggestions. Victoria's smile faltered slightly at the direct challenge, but she quickly recovered. Well, promoting one's consulting business and personal brand, obviously. Using emotional storytelling to generate sympathy and connections. It's quite clever, really. The accusation that Amara's vulnerable sharing about her struggles was merely a calculated business strategy was devastating in its cruelty. Victoria had taken Amara's authentic attempt to inspire others and reframed it as cynical self-promotion. Marcus had heard enough. That's completely inappropriate, Mrs. Thornfield. You're making unfounded accusations about my wife's motives and character. I'm simply observing patterns that are quite common in certain communities, Victoria replied, the racist undertone finally breaking through her veneer of politeness. The tendency to emphasize grievances and obstacles rather than achievements and capabilities. The room seemed to freeze as the overtly racist comment hung in the air. Several nearby conversations stopped entirely as guests processed what they had just heard. Victoria had finally said what she had been implying all evening, that black people inherently focused on complaints rather than accomplishments. Dr. Chen gasped audibly at the blatant racism, while Jonathan Blake's face went pale with shock and anger. Even some of Victoria's usual social allies looked uncomfortable with the explicit nature of her prejudice. Richard Thornfield looked mortified, clearly understanding that his wife had just potentially destroyed important business relationships and embarrassed their family name in front of dozens of influential people. Victoria, he said sharply, his patience finally exhausted. That's completely unacceptable. But Victoria seemed energized by finally speaking her mind openly, as if the pretense of politeness had been exhausting her. Oh, Richard, everyone here knows exactly what I mean. We all see the same patterns, the same tendency to blame others for personal shortcomings. The attack was now completely in the open, with Victoria's racism on full display for everyone to witness. Amara felt the familiar mixture of rage and heartbreak that came with being subjected to such blatant prejudice, especially in a space where she had just moments before felt celebrated and valued. Mrs. Thornfield, Amara said quietly, her voice carrying a dangerous calm, I think you've made your feelings quite clear. Have I? Victoria laughed, seemingly unaware of the shocked silence that had fallen over their section of the ballroom. I hope so. I think clarity is so important in situations like this. The moment stretched taut with tension as Amara stood perfectly still, processing not just the personal attack but the broader implications. This woman had the power to destroy her husband's dreams, to undermine everything they had worked for, simply because she couldn't tolerate sharing space with successful black people. Marcus moved to stand directly beside his wife, his presence protective and defiant. I think my wife has shown remarkable restraint in the face of your completely inappropriate comments, Mrs. Thornfield. Restraint? Victoria's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. How interesting that you frame it that way. In my circles, we call it basic civility and good breeding. The implication that Amara lacked civility and good breeding simply for existing in this space while being black was the final insult. Victoria had systematically attacked her character, her motives, her right to speak, and now her fundamental worthiness as a person. The ballroom had grown noticeably quieter as more guests became aware of the confrontation. Some moved closer to witness the drama, while others stepped back, uncomfortable with the explicit racism being displayed so publicly. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her medical training in crisis intervention kicking in. I think this conversation has gone too far, she said firmly. Perhaps we should all take a step back and remember why we're here tonight. An excellent suggestion, Victoria agreed with renewed brightness, as if she hadn't just delivered a series of racist attacks. We're here to support sick children, not to indulge in personal drama. The phrase personal drama was her final attempt to reframe her racist attacks as somehow being Amara's fault, to position herself as the reasonable party who had been forced to deal with an unreasonable person. Amara looked around the room, seeing the mixture of sympathy, embarrassment, and voyeuristic interest in the faces watching her. She realized that this moment would define not just her own evening, but potentially her entire relationship with this powerful community. The weight of the decision pressed down on her. She could walk away with dignity intact but justice unserved, or she could respond in a way that would ensure Victoria faced consequences for her behavior but might also be characterized as aggressive or inappropriate. As she stood there, surrounded by wealth and influence, facing down a woman whose prejudice was as casual as her designer jewelry, Amara felt the accumulated weight of every similar encounter throughout her life. Every time someone had questioned her qualifications, dismissed her achievements, or suggested she didn't belong in spaces she had earned the right to occupy. The moment hung suspended in time as Amara weighed her options, acutely aware that whatever happened next would ripple far beyond this single evening. Victoria stood before her, radiating the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for her prejudice, someone who believed her wealth and social position made her untouchable. But what Victoria didn't know was that Amara had spent the last 6 months quietly building relationships with every major investor, philanthropist, and business leader in the city. Her consulting work had given her unprecedented access to boardrooms and decision-makers, and she had carefully cultivated a network of allies who respected her judgment and trusted her discretion. "You know, Mrs. Thornfield," Amara said with deadly calm, "you're absolutely right about one thing. Clarity is important in situations like this." Victoria's smile widened, apparently believing she had finally broken Amara's composure and could now claim victory in their psychological warfare. "I'm glad we understand each other," Victoria replied with false warmth. "It saves so much unpleasantness later when everyone knows where they stand." Amara nodded slowly, her mind racing through everything she knew about Thornfield Industries, about Richard's business practices, about the delicate web of relationships that kept their empire functioning. Her consulting work had given her insights into the company's operations that Victoria couldn't possibly imagine. "Speaking of understanding," Amara continued, her voice conversational and friendly, "I was just thinking about my conversation last week with Elena Vasquez at Global Investment Partners. She mentioned some interesting concerns about Thornfield Industries' diversity metrics and their impact on ESG ratings." Victoria's smile flickered slightly, confusion replacing confidence as the conversation took an unexpected turn. Richard Thornfield's attention sharpened immediately. Elena Vasquez controlled billions in investment funds, and her firm's ESG, environmental, social, and governance criteria had become crucial factors in major business decisions. "Elena Vasquez?" Richard repeated, his business instincts overriding his social discomfort. "You know Elena personally?" "Oh yes," Amara replied casually, pulling out her phone. "We've worked together on several projects. Lovely woman. Very passionate about inclusive business practices and social responsibility. She was asking me about potential partners for their new diversity initiative, you know, the one with the $2 billion investment fund?" The blood drained from Victoria's face as she began to understand.